welcome back to Forgotten Gems. I am really excited to be back with this sub-series. It's been a minute and I've been wanting to get back to it for some time just because there's a lot of films out there that I still think deserve some conversation, deserve a little bit more attention and some more eyes on them. But ultimately, Forgotten Gems was started as a way for me personally to deal with the 2020 quarantine and subsequent lockdown. And one of the things I remember very fondly about that time period, I know that sounds weird to say, but during that era, there was just a lot of creative output. A lot of people found a lot of very creative ways of channeling their less than positive emotions. Because we were all dealing with a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of anxiety, and that came out in both very, very public and ugly ways, which we have been privy to over the last couple years, but it also came out in some positive ways. It's always fascinating to me how a culture deals with its fear of the unknown. And how it deals with its fear in general. I mean, you take a look at horror movies, and we've talked about this before on this show, but horror movies are usually a direct reflection of what a society finds terrifying at that particular point in history. Look at the evolution of zombie movies. Zombie movies, originally, zombies were seen as people who were put under voodoo curses. So definitely showing a fear of black influence and foreigners in general. Then it became the result of atomic testing. And now in recent years, it's been biological weapons or genetic tampering that create the zombies. So as we travel through time, we get to see the different things that have frightened people, subconsciously or not. And what's really interesting when we take this thesis and you look at the 90s, let's really talk about the 90s for a second. I'm a 90s kid. I am of that generation. I am the kind of the tail end of Generation X, the Clerks generation, just slightly into that becoming millennial generation. But yeah, the 90s were my decade. That was the decade of my teenage and adolescent years. And I think the decade that is kind of most responsible for the formation of my psyche in the way that it is now. I mean, the 80s play a part, but, you know, the 90s is when you're trying to discover, like, who you are, you know, your teenage years, when you're really kind of a lot more self-aware and much more aware of the world around you. And looking back on it, what I find interesting about the 90s is that one of the big problems we had is that we did not have a lot to fear. Now, I'm not looking at the 90s through rose-colored glasses and saying that nothing was wrong, it was this perfect decade and everything was wonderful, and until that, you know, George W. came along, we were all skipping through this idyllic G-rated wonderland. That's not the truth. There were a lot of problems, but you compare the 90s to the decades that had immediately succeeded and that were immediately going to follow it. You know, you look at the 70s and Vietnam and, you know, the coming of the 2000s and 9/11 and everything that has followed there. The 90s feel like this little microcosm of time where, yes, there were a lot of problems and bad things were happening, but in terms of things we feared, there was not a lot. And so when it comes to our entertainment, we began to look elsewhere for things to fear. This is one of the reasons why I feel that the concept of aliens, alien abduction, encounter with aliens, these had a huge spike in popularity in the 90s. I mean, think about it. The 90s was the golden age of Star Trek, which, yes, a much more positive show. All three of them. But they introduced us to the Borg, the Cardassians, the Herosian, the Vidians, all of which physical embodiments of personal fears of what humans could be if we went too far in a single direction. A few years from the time this movie was released, one of the biggest movies of the decade, Independence Day, about alien invasion, would hit. The same year as this movie came out, a little TV show called The X-Files debuted, which really blew the lid off our paranoia, not only of some existential force coming to get us, but it teaming up with our mistrust of the federal government and all of them conspiring to fuck us over. So, the 90s were really a time when we were looking to the stars for the next big threat. And in the middle of all this, all these much more well-known and much more culturally relevant examples, there was this little film that I won't say kick-started the whole thing, but is certainly one of the first real examples of us really looking for something out there to be afraid of. And that is 1993's Fire in the Sky, starring D.B. Sweeney and Robert Patrick. Ironically, an actor who would later appear on The X-Files as John Doggett. So this film does have a bit of a reputation as being one of the most horrifying films on the subject of alien abduction ever made. And it is a reputation that is well earned. But before we get to that, let's talk about what this film is about. So this film is inspired by a true story. Now, that's always hard to say when you're talking about stories of alien abduction, because of course there are people who believe and there are people who don't. So let's say that it is inspired by true accounts of an actual event. Indeed, it is a movie based on one of the most well-documented examples of alien abduction in history, in that multiple people have corroborated the story. So as much as any story of alien abduction can be said to be true, this one has the most evidence to back it up, or the most witnesses to confirm it. And so when we kind of talk about this instance, this is what most people point to as actual evidence that this happened. So what this movie tells us the story, the true story, of a lumberjack by the name of Travis Walton, who in November 5th, 1975, he and a group of 4 friends were driving back from a job. They worked as lumberjacks, and they were driving back from their day's work, and they see something that looks like a forest fire off in the distance. They drive up to investigate it, and as the story goes, they see this ship hovering in the middle of the forest. Walton gets out of the truck for reasons known only to him and approaches the ship and is subsequently abducted by aliens. The other 4 guys get the hell out of there and get back to town and attempt to tell people what happened, and of course are immediately thought of as loonies. It is actually theorized for a while that they killed Walton and concocted this story as a way of covering up the crime, which I can see how authorities would come to that conclusion, but if I had just murdered someone and was trying to come up with a plausible story as to what happened to them, saying they were abducted by aliens just doesn't seem like the path I would go. That's just me. I'm a different breed of cat. But but they're being investigated, and they are very, they're under suspicion. The whole town thinks that they did it, and they're about to be arrested when 5 days later, Walton is discovered pretty out of it, dehydrated, and just, kind of spacey, if you'll pardon the expression, strolling down one of the roads. And he's found. Obviously, they didn't kill him. And he tells them this story of being abducted and experimented on an alien spacecraft. So that's the story and both the plot of the movie. It follows that story fairly faithfully. So you don't only have Walton's explanation of what happened, but you also have the early part of it confirmed and backed up by the 4 other guys in the truck. And all of them have stuck to this story, as far as I know, all the way up into the present day. So, seems like a great idea for a movie. And indeed, it is for a good chunk of the film. So this film follows this story very faithfully, telling the majority of it from the point of view of the 4 guys who were in the truck, with Robert Patrick being kind of our main character, the main guy who's trying to deter the rumors that he did anything, and also trying to get people to look for his friend. He's freaked out about his friend, feels guilty for leaving him behind, and all of that. The film where the film has its greatest strengths is it is incredibly well done in these early sections of creating a lot of atmosphere and a lot of tension. You really, as an audience member, you really feel the fear of these guys for what they have seen, and the added fear of what they are now being accused of. You feel the claustrophobic nature of the situation. Like, I hate to use the term the noose tightening. I think that's kind of a repulsive phrase. But you really do feel it, especially through Robert Patrick, who is a far better actor than I think anyone has ever given him credit for. Of course, he is most known as the T-1000 from Terminator 2. But that's about as indicative of his acting ability as, Robin Williams voicing the genie was of his. I think Robert Patrick has always been a very good and very understated actor. Going back to the X-Files, and I've mentioned this several times, I really liked the character of John Doggett. Yes, he was not Fox Mulder, and he came into the show at a very difficult time, but the character was really good, and he did a really good job playing him. So I've always liked Robert Patrick, and he does a really great job in this role. You feel for this man. He's the emotional center of the film. Because it's his anxiety and his fear that we really experience all of this through. And he plays the everyman really, really well. I think you also have to give special applause to a couple other actors. James Garner plays the law enforcement officer who's been called in to kind of investigate this, and kind of the, obviously the skeptic, and the guy's like, I don't believe any of this baloney. You guys did something to this man, and I'm going to find out what. And then even when Walton comes back, that feeling of, okay, you're not telling me something. I don't believe this story. Where were you really? And never does it to an extreme where you're, in alien abduction movies or alien movies or supernatural movies, there's always the Scully, which is an unfair term because Scully was a great character, but there's always that Scully of, you're crazy, I don't believe you, and the person we're obviously supposed to hate as the audience. they never let him cross over into that realm. They always kind of keep him in this is the guy who's seeing things as we would most likely if someone walked into our neighborhood and said, I was abducted by aliens. He's responding the same way I think most of us would respond, even true believers. I really think so. And of course it's James Garner, who's just a phenomenal actor. So I really, it's always good to see him. And special praise has to go to D.B. Sweeney for his role as Travis Walton, another actor who has had a really great career, but I don't think has ever really gotten the praise for the caliber of actor he actually is. And he's very damn good here. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. This DVD includes an interview with him, and he talks about the reason he took the role is because when reading the script, there's an extended scene in it where he is weightless. He wakes up on the alien craft, he's weightless, and he's floating around in this kind of zero-G tunnel. There's a pretty extended sequence, and D.B. Sweeney took this role because he really wanted to play Spider-Man. At the time this movie was being made, there was a great deal of buzz about James Cameron directing a Spider-Man film. And the folks doing the special effects for this film were connected to doing the special effects for that film. So Sweeney thought, if I go in there and I do this role and I show them I can do this wire work, then they'll put in a good word for me with James Cameron to play Peter Parker. Which I gotta respect that reasoning. I really have to respect that reasoning. Of course, the James Cameron film didn't happen. But D.B. Sweeney got a pretty once-in-a-lifetime acting opportunity. So the director does a great job with building tension, and then when D.B. Sweeney is returned, of also, again, pouring gasoline on that fire, because we know what it's building up to. We know it's building up to this scene, and this is a scene that they tease very heavily in the trailer. Any advertisements you see for this film, or anytime you hear people talk about this film, what they talk about is the scene. You know, the scene of the experimentation and him floating around in this in the spaceship. And I got to tell you, folks, the hype is justified. It is one of the most disturbing, horrific, frightening scenes I've ever witnessed. And I admit I'm a wimp when it comes to horror movie and horror imagery. But I've seen my fair share of alien abduction things. I watched The X-Files religiously. So I thought again, 93, right? So you're like, okay, it's 2022, or, I forget the first time I actually saw this movie, but you're thinking, okay, I've seen things, how scary can it be? It's a bunch of puppets and, okay, whatever. No, folks, it's fucked up. It is a fucking horror show. Like, the director, and again, what I love about it is that it's all built up to it. This isn't like a horrifically violent, gnarly scene just out of nowhere for no reason. The film is leading to this, and every bit of tension that is built up in this film is leading to this moment. And when it happens, it is a huge payoff. And it's that kind of scary that you cannot turn away from, that you want really badly to turn away from, but you can't. So if your whole movie is building to one scene, then you have to make sure the setup is good, which it is, and you have to make sure the scene itself delivers, which it does. There are a lot of wonderful directorial choices that go into this film. For instance, one of the things that D.B. Sweeney discovers when he's floating around the ship is that the common perception of aliens, the big heads with the big eyes, no mouths and nose, that perception are actually spacesuits that the actual aliens wear. which I think is a pretty clever choice, to be honest. There are some odd choices that I had, and I know why they were made, but I always find it interesting in these films about alien abduction, that the outside of the alien ship is always very sleek, very modern. They always hear, they don't make noise, and they show up and they move at terrific speeds. And yet whenever we go inside the ship, they always closely resemble the alien ships from Alien. All of this like organic cave, like it's made, like it's sculpted out of bone and shit. And it's like, why would the outside of your ship look one way, but the inside of your ship look this way? That doesn't make any sense. And this film goes so far in that direction that it is a little bit distracting. Like, it's so primitive inside that you do kind of go, okay, how the hell did you build that? Why did you build the interior of your ship to look like this? It doesn't make sense. I know, a nitpick, but it's something that a lot of these films do. So yeah. But now here's where this film kind of falls flat. It really falls flat. As I've said, if your whole film is building to one scene, then you've got to make sure the setup is really good, the execution of that scene is flawless, both of which this film does well, but then once that scene is done, you got to make sure it sticks the landing. It's kind of like, as a pro wrestling fan, anytime we have a character who is undefeated for any stretch of time and people are really hyping up the undefeated streak, you have to know that eventually that person is going to lose. And it's how good they are after they lose that tells the story. And a lot of times they build these people up with these win streaks, and then they lose and all the air goes out of them. And that's kind of what happens with this movie. We build up, we have this scene, and the ending of it is just very mundane and very dull. And D.B. Sweeney even says in the interview that's the thing he's most disappointed about the movie, is the ending. He thinks the film was built up really well, but the ending is just kind of very ho-hum of him and Robert Patrick kind of just going, oh, okay, well, let's be friends again. Let's put traumatic things behind us. And he says, I wanted more of an ending. Now, and that's a very difficult thing to do in a film like this, because we don't get any answers. The actual Travis Walton didn't get any answers. So we as the audience don't get any answers. Why were they here? Why were they abducting people? What were they trying to find out? We're never privy to that information. So because it's not like an Independence Day where the main character is the president, someone who you can understand would be finding out all this information, this is a common person. This is an everyday Joe, literally. And he's not going to get any of those big answers. And I feel like the better thing that they should have done, and what maybe would have made this movie really stick the landing and really maybe break through and become a genuine classic, is to have this movie end with him pondering those exact questions. Why did they do this? Why did they pick me? What were they trying to find out? And more importantly, why was I returned? Because we see as he's going through the ship that he finds other human bodies. So apparently they have killed other people in these experiments. And he's not the first person they've abducted. And he's not probably going to be the last, but he's one of the ones that survived. They returned him. Why? He has this line at the end, and it's used kind of as a joke, where he says, I don't think you have to worry about them coming back. I don't think they liked me very much. And, again, it's done as a joke, but you could have really weighted that line down with, there's something about me they didn't like. There's something about me they wanted to get rid of. What was it? What's going to happen when they come back? And I think leaving us on more of that kind of a cliffhanger would have been more in keeping with the tone and atmosphere that the film had gone through great lengths to set up in service of that one really terrific scene. So the movie is very good. I enjoy this movie, especially as a fan of alien abduction stories, and so, that was something I was really into as a kid. And yes, it falls flat there at the end, and that does affect the rest of the film. But the rest of it is incredibly well acted and incredibly well done. And yeah, that scene is everything you have heard it is and more. Interestingly enough, I have to point this out, is that according to the actual Travis Walton's testimony of what happened, that scene that this film is most famous for is actually all fiction. That according to him, the interior of the ship was very sleek. The room where the experiments were done was very sterile, very white. The aliens were not these horrific monstrosities of fear. So it's interesting that even in this story, Hollywood took extreme liberties with it. But I think it's to the better for terms of narrative structure. So if you're a fan of these types of stories, you like the alien abduction stories, you were a fan of the X-Files, and you haven't watched this film, I think you owe it to yourself. Just be prepared for the air coming out of it right after that climactic scene, which luckily that's most of the way through the movie. So you only got like a little bit of like maybe 20 minutes left after that, where the film is very flat and dull, and you're like, oh, really? That's how we're ending this? But I think it is worth a watch. So, you know, Halloween's coming out, maybe treat yourself to a scare. Halloween's coming up, I should say. So treat yourself to a scare. All right. So it is great to be back. Thank you for joining me for another Forgotten Gem. Hopefully we'll have more of these coming up in the near future. And as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.